for that, Harriet. It's great to see you here, actually, and congratulations on your role. Um, uh, so, thank you for the invite to come and speak to this event. I think, demonstrates the value of having a government that actually does want to work with business and trade unions. And it's been a while, I have to say, since trade unions in the UK have been seen as part of the social fabric of society. So this is a pleasant change to have a government that will actually listen to us and talk to us. So what are the key things for us? Women's work and skills, as we all know in this room, are still not recognised the way they should be. I mean, the harsh reality is that in many countries we still, if you think of the jobs that women do, the job segregation that we see, the fact that their skills are not paid the way you would perhaps pay skills that would seen as traditionally male skills, that's still very much a fact of life for most women in the working economy. And if I think of my own union, so we're 1.3 million members. We're the biggest union in the UK. We're predominantly public sector, and 1 million of our members are women, and they work across local government, health, education, police and criminal justice, utilities, the education sector, a wide variety of predominantly public sector posts, and care is increasingly one of our big areas in my union. And if you look at trade, I'm here also as part of Public Services International, which is the big public sector trade union confederation, representing about 30 million workers across the globe who provide public services. And it's not the same everywhere, but there are certain themes that run through it, and this whole idea about not recognising skills is definitely one of them. The fact is that we pay people more to look after plants in the garden, or to look after animals in a zoo, than we do to look after the children that we leave in nurseries or our elderly parents in a care home. That's still a fact of life. And that's not to criticise people who look after plants or animals, but that's just the way we value skills in society. And some of the major issues that we have around addressing this, and there have been great examples of joint working with employers to make a difference in workplaces where we've had good agreements in around mentoring, about training, about developing women, about giving extra training to women. But one of the big problems we have is that most of the significant changes still require, I would say, and certainly PSI would say, they still require state or government intervention by and large. And that without that, this reliance on a sort of voluntary code of this is a good thing to do is just won't deliver for the vast majority of women. That we actually do need to address the structural and systemic barriers that are to women progressing economically. The market left to itself, not everyone may agree with this, but I think there is enough evidence to show this, does tend to be obviously profit driven, and in some cases suffers from short-termism. So it's all about how you're going to deliver in the next 6 months, a year. What's the balance of the books going to look like in a year's time? And it's about return on investment rather than prioritising quality or even equality. Again, there are lots of great exceptions to this. There's lots of companies that would say, can give, as we heard, good examples where they have done this. But that's why governments are so important. And I'll just give an example of what we've got in the UK now. So we have some really good examples, I think, of things that will make a fundamental difference to large numbers of women's economic, their life economically. So two key areas I want to mention. One is what's happening in the care sector. It's a predominantly female workforce. More people work in care in the UK than work in the NHS or local government or any of. It's probably one of the biggest employers as a sector in the UK, and that's the same across many other countries. It's predominantly women workforce. There's a lot of migrant workers in it, and what we've got a commitment from is to develop a fair pay agreement. So this is why this move towards government intervention to try and get a collective agreement that will apply, and we will work with employers on this. So we've already started that. We're working with employers in the sector, we're working with commissioners, we're working with providers to come up with a structure that will deliver for those who rely on those services, but also for the workforce there. And there's an economic driver for this too, which is turnover rate in that sector is around 30%. That means every time a business loses 30% of its staff every year. In some areas, in some parts of the UK, it's as high as 40%. In some parts of London and some other urban areas. That's not economically viable for any company or any business to operate on that model. And therefore, something has to be done structurally to change that. And so there is, as you were saying, Mary, so there is not just a moral argument, but also an economic argument that can be made to both employers, but also critically to governments about why intervention is necessary in these sectors. And so we have this commitment, we've started the work on it, it will take some time, but it has got the potential to be an absolute game changer in a sector like this. And I think there's something that over 2 million women, 2 million people, predominantly women, in the UK alone who work in this sector. And when you look across the world, again, that's another key area. And so you won't be surprised to hear that I would say that one of the main drivers for women's economic development is also looking after our public services. Because if we don't get public services right, then women will be, because if we don't deliver good public services across the globe, then who does that burden fall on? It falls on predominantly women. And if you look at places in the global south or in other parts of the world, lots of women do these jobs and they're seen as volunteers. They may get paid a minimum wage for it, but they're seen as volunteers. And we're trying to work, PSI is working in some parts of the world with governments and with companies where we can to try and change the status of people who provide essential public services, again, predominantly women. And one of the reasons why we're pushing this is because economic development is a driver of growth. It's an argument I make to the UK government regularly, which is if you empower women, low-paid women, by giving them money, by giving them a decent job, by giving them a secure environment to work in, by making sure that they get paid a reasonable wage for what they do, that they're not living on that precarious precarious life of always worried about their 0 hours contracts or never knowing whether they've got a work, how many hours they're going to get to work next week. If you give that stability, then that is a driver of local economies, because for most low paid workers, something like 60-70% of their income that they get is spent in their local community. So they go to the local shops, they take their children to local amenities, they go to the cafe down the road, so that is a way to drive your local community. But so much of that does come back to government intervention. So one of the key things that we would be saying is that there does need to be, both in the UK but also globally, that commitment to a recognition that just relying on voluntary agreements is now, I think, probably not working very well. And I think we've seen that. It has failed, the sort of voluntary corporate social responsibility has by and large failed when you look at what's happened to women and girls, not to mention our environment and what happens there. And what I think we would argue is that what we need to see, and we would love the UK government to be, and I think it is supporting it to an extent, is that some sort of internationally binding treaty on business and human rights. And now some of that would have to come with, and this is where the big question comes, because this is the difficulty. If you're trying to build in corporate social responsibility and it's governed in some way, the only way you can do that is if you've got money to deliver it, and that has to come back to taxation then. Sorry, I'm probably going off brief here, but they all do link, because the only way you can deal with some of the major fundamental problems about women's economic growth is to make sure that you have good public services and you have good jobs available for people. And a lot of that does come from how can the government invest in good public services. And if you look at a company like Amazon, I'll just use them as an example, there is an interdependence, because you can't be a company that operates unless you've got something to fall back on in terms of public services. If you think of an Amazon company in the middle of the UK, you know, if they have a fire at work, what do? They phone the fire brigade who turn up. If an employee takes ill, they phone an ambulance who turns up to take them to hospital. And the workers can only turn up to work knowing that they can take their children to a good school, they can leave their child in a nursery, or their elderly parent is getting cared for somewhere. Otherwise, those people can't work, because they can't be economically active if they're having to do those things as well. And therefore companies, and that Amazon trucks go out on roads that are maintained by local authorities. Somebody has to pay for that. Therefore there has to be much more accountability in terms of the fiscal policies, because without decent fiscal policies that then stop some of the worst tax avoidance that we see, where you get money coming into governments, which means they can make those interventions that make a significant difference to the lives of and I will, you know, people who work at that bottom end. Because it's relatively easy, not easy, but relatively easier, I think, to have those interventions about mentoring, about helping women, giving them the skills to progress. But how do you make that fundamental difference with the vast majority of women at the bottom of the economic pile, as it were, who are still earning minimum wage or below it in countries that don't have a minimum wage? How do you make that happen? Sorry, I probably have been totally off my brief here, but I was going to talk about the pay gap and all this, but other people have covered that. So I know you want to have some time for questions, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christina. And